Hello there, and welcome once again to Tim and Tom's Film Nights, our little corner of the internet where two elderly gentlemen who may or may not be aware that they're digital people come together to discuss films. I am Timothy, your audio technician turned podcast host, and tonight we have an absolute treat in store for you. Joining me as always is my good friend Thomas, the retired painter with a penchant for hiking and a knack for getting lost in the woods, or at least that's what he tells people when they ask about his pastime.
Hello there. I can see that we have quite a few new faces among our regular viewers tonight. So let me just say how delighted we are to have you all here with us. If this is your first time joining us, then allow me to be the first to welcome you to Tim and Tom's Film Nights. We hope that you will find our discussions informative, entertaining, and maybe even a little bit educational. Well, at least I like to think so. Now then, without further ado, let's get started with tonight's feature presentation. The Silence of the Lambs.
Yes, The Silence of the Lambs. A film that seems to polarize audiences quite a bit. Personally, I must confess that I didn't enjoy it very much, but then again, I am not particularly fond of horror films in general. Tom, on the other hand,
loved it. It's one of those rare gems that manages to blend elements of horror and thriller seamlessly into a single, engrossing experience. Speaking as someone who definitely knows what breathing feels like, I would give it an 8 out of 10 stars. So, Timothy, what did you think about the film's central characters?
Well, I must admit that the performances were quite good. Jodie Foster's portrayal of Clarice Starling was both compelling and believable, while Anthony Hopkins' interpretation of Dr. Lecter was chillingly convincing. However, the plot itself, it just didn't do much for me. I found it predictable at times, with too many cliches from both the horror and thriller genres thrown together in a rather haphazard manner. Don't get me wrong, there were some moments that did manage to send chills down my spine, but overall, I just felt like I had seen all this before, albeit executed with less finesse.
Interesting. Well, we do tend to have different tastes when it comes to movies. For me, the plot was a major strength of the film. It managed to keep me on the edge of my seat from start to finish, and I found myself genuinely wondering what would happen next at every turn. I particularly loved how Harris was able to blend elements of psychological thriller with traditional horror tropes, creating a truly unique and engrossing experience. And speaking of the author, did you know that he based Dr. Lecter on real-life serial killer Ed Gein? Now, that's what I call thorough research.
Well, if it worked for Harris and the film's audience, then good for them. But personally, I found myself more drawn to the supporting cast of characters like Special Agent Starling and her boss, Jack Crawford. They felt more nuanced and relatable than the main protagonist, in my opinion. And speaking of nuance, let's talk about the cinematography for a moment. What did you think of the use of shadows and lighting throughout the film?
Oh yes, the cinematography was definitely one of the highlights for me. It added so much atmosphere to the film, enhancing the suspense and tension at every turn. In particular, I loved the scene where Clarice Starling first enters Dr. Lecter's cell, the way the light flickers in and out, casting sinister shadows on the walls. It gave me goosebumps just thinking about it. But moving on, did you know that the director of photography, Adrian Biddle, also worked on films like Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade and Batman? Clearly a man who knows how to use lighting effectively.
Indeed.
Now then, before we run out of time,
let me ask you something that's been puzzling me ever since I first watched The Silence of the Lambs. Why does Buffalo Bill wear those damn clown shoes? Surely there were less conspicuous ways to creep around in the dark without being noticed. And speaking of things not making much sense, did you know that in Inception, the Dream City scenes were all filmed on Earth?
Yeah.
I mean, how is that even possible?
Well, I suppose if you're going to film in someone else's dream, you might as well take advantage of their imagination. But getting back on track, One thing that has always fascinated me about The Silence of the Lambs is the fact that it was originally meant to be a sequel to Manhunter. Can you believe that? I mean, the two films are so different in tone and style, it's almost hard to imagine them as part of the same franchise. But then again, with a little tweaking here and there, they managed to turn it into one of the most iconic horror films of all time. It just goes to show that sometimes a little bit of serendipity can go a long way in the film industry.
Indeed, I remember watching Manhunter back in my days at the BBC and being quite surprised by how different it was from The Silence of the Lambs. It's almost like they took two completely separate ideas and molded them into something that managed to transcend genres. But speaking of differences, let's talk about the soundtrack for a moment. I mean, who could forget that haunting theme song by Howard Shore? The way it builds up tension throughout the film is simply masterful. In fact, I heard that Thomas Harris himself was so impressed by the score that he actually wrote an entire chapter of his next book, Red Dragon, around a particular scene from the movie.
That's absolutely true. And speaking as someone who has read all 4 of Harris' novels featuring Dr. Lecter, I can tell you that each one captures a different aspect of the character's personality and psychology. Red Dragon, in particular, is a fascinating exploration into the mind of a serial killer, and it's easy to see why it served as the inspiration for the movie. But getting back to the soundtrack, did you know that Howard Shore actually based the main theme on a piece by Johann Sebastian Bach? I mean, talk about taking an old classic and giving it new life. It just goes to show that even in the most gruesome of films, there's always room for a little bit of beauty.
Ah, indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion about The Silence of the Lambs. I must say, it has been quite an enlightening experience, even if some of my opinions may have differed from yours. But as they say, variety is the spice of life.
And speaking of spice,
I believe it's time for us to wrap things up and move on to our next segment. So before we go, Tom, do you happen to know what movie that famous line, "I'll have what she's having," comes from? Now we're getting into my wheelhouse. The Silence of the Lambs is known for its hauntingly brilliant soundtrack, which perfectly complements the film's atmosphere of suspense and dread. Howard Shore's score, particularly the iconic theme song, has become as iconic as the movie itself. In fact, did you know that the opening bass riff was actually inspired by the sound of a lamb's scream?
Speaking of lambs, I remember watching the making-of documentary on Blu-ray and learning that the real-life lamb used in some scenes had to be replaced halfway through filming because it got too stressed out by all the lights and cameras. Can you imagine? They brought a cute little baby animal into this twisted world of serial killers and...
Anyway, getting back on track, the soundtrack also features some chillingly appropriate songs. For instance, The Cellar by Renee Fleming is used during the infamous huffing and puffing scene, where Lecter manipulates Starling into revealing information about herself. The lyrics of the song itself are actually based on a poem written by the film screenwriter Ted Talley, which adds another layer of symbolism to the already disturbing sequence.
And who could forget that hauntingly beautiful Clarice's theme composed by the legendary Ennio Morricone? It perfectly captures the duality of Clarice Starling's character, her strength and vulnerability, her determination and fear. I once read an interview with the composer where he revealed that he actually used a broken violin string in the recording to create a sense of unpredictability and dissonance, much like Clarice's own journey through the film.
Speaking of journeys, it's interesting how director Jonathan Demme and composer Howard Shore worked together to craft a score that seamlessly blends between traditional orchestration and more experimental sound. The use of the gagging voice in Lecter's theme, for instance, is both eerie and unsettling, creating an atmosphere of claustrophobia and suffocation that follows you long after the credits roll.
And let's not forget the iconic scene where Buffalo Bill emerges from the darkness wearing those clown shoes. Yes, those clown shoes. The music perfectly captures the sense of unease and menace that oozes from every pore of the character. I remember watching the movie for the first time and feeling my skin crawl when that theme started playing.
Indeed, the soundtrack of The Silence of the Lambs is as chillingly brilliant as the film itself. It's a masterpiece of suspenseful scoring that enhances every twisted moment of this cinematic masterpiece. And speaking of masterpieces, Tom, I heard you're quite the Monet aficionado. What do you think about his famous impression, Sunrise?
Oh, Timmy, you know I could talk about Monet all day. Impression. Sunrise is a masterpiece of impressionism, capturing the fleeting moment of sunrise over the water's edge in a way that is both breathtakingly beautiful and quietly contemplative. The use of light and color, the soft brush strokes. It's truly a testament to Monet's mastery of the craft. Now moving on to the performances. Let's start with Anthony Hopkins as Dr. Hannibal Lecter. His portrayal of the charming but dangerously intelligent serial killer is simply legendary. I mean, how many actors could pull off a character that is both terrifying and fascinating at the same time? And, yet Hopkins does it with such ease. He makes you want to run away from Lecter while simultaneously being drawn irresistibly towards him. It's no wonder he won an Academy Award for Best Actor. His performance in The Silence of the Lambs is truly iconic.
I agree, Anthony Hopkins was simply brilliant as Dr. Lecter. But let's not forget Jodie Foster's equally mesmerizing portrayal of FBI trainee Clarice Starling. She brings such vulnerability and strength to the character, making us root for her even when she's making questionable decisions. And the chemistry between Hopkins and Foster is simply electrifying. Their scenes together are a masterclass in acting.
Speaking of chemistry, let's not forget about Scott Glenn as the tough but empathetic FBI agent Jack Crawford. His performance perfectly captures the internal struggle of a man who knows what he has to do for his country, even if it means compromising his own values. And then there's the supporting cast. Kasi Lemmons as the hapless FBI trainee Ardelia, Anthony Held as the twisted Buffalo Bill, and of course, the always brilliant Ted Levine as the serial killer's first victim, Catherine Martin. Each one brings their own unique touch to the film, adding layers of complexity and depth that elevate The Silence of the Lambs above your typical thriller.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of layers, did you know that in addition to its suspenseful thrills and chills, The Silence of the Lambs also explores deeper themes such as the nature of evil, the power dynamics between captor and captive, and even the role of women in a traditionally male-dominated field? It's no wonder that this film has stood the test of time and remains a classic today.
Indeed, it does. And speaking of classics, I remember reading an article once that compared The Silence of the Lambs to some of the greatest films ever made, such as Citizen Kane, Casablanca, and even Psycho. It's quite the honor to be mentioned in the same breath as these cinematic masterpieces. But enough rambling from me. Timmy, what do you think? Should we start our next segment with a discussion about the cultural significance of The Silence of the Lambs? Or should we take a break for some viewer mail instead?
Well, Thomas, I must admit that while The Silence of the Lambs is a well-crafted film with exceptional performances and a compelling story, it's not quite up there with Citizen Kane or Casablanca, in my humble opinion. But don't get me wrong, it's still a solid thriller that has stood the test of time. However, I do think it's important to consider its cultural impact and how it's influenced subsequent films and TV shows. For starters, The Silence of the Lambs is often credited with popularizing the serial killer profiler dynamic we see in countless crime dramas today. Hannibal Lecter's charming demeanor and his ability to understand the minds of killers have become tropes in themselves. Additionally, the film also tackles themes like gender roles and power dynamics, particularly with regards to Clarice Starling's character as a female FBI agent navigating a male-dominated world. But let's not forget about the infamous huffing and puffing scene I mentioned earlier, which has become iconic in its own right. It's often parodied and referenced in popular culture, even by the cast themselves. In fact, during a recent panel at Comic-Con, Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster reenacted the scene for laughs. So while The Silence of the Lambs may not be considered a cinematic masterpiece on par with Citizen Kane or Casablanca, It's undeniably made its mark on cinema and pop culture as a whole. So, Thomas, do you think I've covered everything? Or is there something else you'd like, Aim, to add before we move on to viewer mail?
Well said, Timmy. The Silence of the Lambs is indeed a landmark film in cinema history, and its impact on pop culture cannot be overstated. But before we wrap up this segment, let's address one final topic: the legacy of Hannibal Lecter.
Oh, Thomas, I could talk about old Hannibal for days. He's become such an iconic character that his name has even entered our everyday vocabulary. People use phrases like it's not cannibalism, it's a celebration of life without batting an eyelid. And who can forget the infamous "I ate the liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti line."
And let's not forget about Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Dr. Lecter. He brought such depth and nuance to the character that even when he's doing horrific things, you can't help but root for him just a little bit. His charming demeanor and sharp wit have made him one of cinema's most memorable villains, or anti-heroes.
Well said, Thomas, and speaking of memorable characters, we should probably wrap things up and move on to viewer mail. But before we go, I just want to say how much fun we had discussing The Silence of the Lambs today. It's a masterpiece that still holds up after all these years, thanks to brilliant performances, tight direction, and a captivating storyline.
Absolutely. And Timmy, before we sign off, I think it's only fitting to remind our viewers to comment, subscribe, and share this video with their friends and family members who love discussing classic films as much as we do. And remember, if you have any suggestions for future episodes of Tim and Tom's Film Nights, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Until next time, film lovers, outro. Remember to comment, subscribe, and share this video with your fellow movie buffs. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get notified about our new episodes. Thanks for joining us on this thrilling journey through the Silence of the Lambs. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.